Hi guys, so today we're going to try recreating some video game lighting. Recently, video game engines have gotten really advanced and have led to a lot of really realistic and cinematic lighting in games, and I thought it would be really cool to try and recreate some of it. The Last of Us 2 came out recently, and I thought it would be a perfect example of this. The lighting in-game and in the cinematics is really pretty, and I thought it would be really cool to try and mimic some of that. So as you see on the screen now, we have this shot of Ellie from the game. I thought we'd break it down into 3 different elements. The first one being the main/key light, the second being the defining or the backlight, and the third being the extraneous or what I like to call immersion light. You'll notice that the terms I use are pretty different from a lot of different lighting tutorials. I'll go into more depth about that in another video, but the reason I use terms like that is so that it doesn't pigeonhole us into one way of lighting, and it makes us think about why we're lighting something and not just how we're lighting it. So yeah, let's get started. Let's take a look at our first element. You'll notice here, lighting about 3/4 of her face is a nice soft light. Not super soft, there's still a defining edge, giving us this triangle that you see in a lot of movies. A lot of that also has to do with her defining features being very rigid. We have her nose and her eyebrows kind of casting these sort of shadows. And one thing we should pay attention to are the shadows themselves, as it gives us a lot of clues about the light. For one, the angle that the shadows fall gives us the direction of the light. So you'll notice that the shadow of the nose and the eyebrows kind of come down in this angle. So the light probably also shoots from that angle. How dark the shadows are also tells us that the scene is pretty contrasty, so the light is either really close or it's a really strong light, giving us the nice fall off in this direction. You'll notice that the eyes also point the direction of the light. She is looking in the direction that we think the light is coming from, which is probably why she's also getting this really cool eye light, because the light bounces from the pupils to the lens itself. One thing to note about our main light is because she has a rounded face, well, everyone's face is rounded and not a flat surface, the light shoots past her face and bounces off whatever is past there, and that gives us this nice defining edge. It happens all the time in real life, and what's nice about it is since this is such a high contrast scene, it helps separate her cheek from this really dark area of her body. You'll notice on her face that she has these highlights across her nose and the inside of her cheek. A lot of times these are mistaken for higher quantities of light, but what they actually are what are called specular reflections. And what it is there's some sort of reflective film on her face, whether it's sweat or water or oil, something of the sort, and that in itself is reflecting the light that's lighting her. And so when we do our recreation, we'll take note of that, and maybe we'll add a little bit of water, or if the actress or actor has naturally oily skin, we'll probably get that naturally. For the second element, it's pretty simple. It's just a typical backer kicker light. You'll see it on her hair here, her ear, the side of her face, and then along the shoulders. Now, it doesn't seem like it's coming from a direct back angle, more of an off angle, and that's what allows it to spill on this side of the cheek. You'll notice it also gives a defining edge on this side of the shoulder, which helps separate it from this background here and helps let us know, at least subconsciously, where she is in relationship to the shot. And finally, we have our immersion or extraneous light, and we see that across the background itself. Now, the lens they use in-game for this is really shallow, so we know that she's in some sort of forest scene, but we don't really know the specifics about the background, like is it a tree, is it a bush, is this just the ground? It doesn't really matter. What we need to know is that some sort of light is hitting the background, and it's just adding a nice texture, so it's not one flat image across, it's actually little blotches of light. And that just adds some interest, so not only is it separated from the rest of the subject, but it doesn't make the image feel fake. It feels like it's all part of the same scene. And that's really key here, because we want to make sure that at all times the audience, or in this case the player, is always focused on the story in the game, and they never think about the lighting. So just a quick review, our first element is the key light coming from this direction. That gives us our shadows, our triangle, and our eye light, as well as this reflection on the opposite cheek. Then we have our backlight, which is coming from this direction, and that gives us these little defining edges here. And then we have our extraneous light in the background, and that gives us this texture here. And now that we know all those elements, let's try and do it ourselves. Let's start with the main light. For this, I positioned a large soft source, camera right, at a slightly elevated angle. Because of space limitations, the light had to be fairly close to the subject. However, this did help with a couple things. For one, it was easier to get a higher angle. Also, because of how close the light was, it wasn't hard to get more contrast. If you want to know more about how the distance of light affects the subject, check out my video on free lighting tips. One problem that I did face was that the fall off was a little too fast, and the light wasn't as even as I'd like. So I added a frame of diffusion to part of the light to help even it out. It did make the light a little softer than desired, but given what I had available, I was pretty happy with how it looked. Next is the backlight. For this, I used a slightly smaller source so that I could control it more. You'll notice that I have a grid on it, which helps with this. Backlight can often be finicky with getting it to look exactly how you want, so I played around with it until it was close enough to the reference shot. You'll also note that I lifted part of the grid to work as our third element. By opening up the grid and aiming the light properly, I allowed some light to spill into the background, giving us the texture we needed. Lastly, I added a small bounce with some flags to control it to give a little of that bounce back on the opposite cheek. I had a bit of a hard time getting the positioning exactly right, but I think it turned out okay. So let's take a look at these elements independently. Overall, I think it turned out pretty good. Some things you'll notice is that the face shape and skin tone make a big difference in lighting. My subject had a slightly darker complexion, which absorbed more light than Ellie's. You'll also notice that Ellie has much more rigid and defined facial features than my subject, which is why she has more shadow in her eye sockets and a bigger nose shadow. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the results. It took about an hour to do, including all the setup, but I'm very impressed with how realistic the in-game lighting is. I'm excited to see where gaming engines go from here and how much better they'll get. If you like this video, please give it a like, and if you want to see more, please feel free to subscribe. Thanks.